Snow moved like sifted moon dust across the empty road the night Colt Maddox first saw her, each flake drifting slow enough to make time feel tired. Winter had settled over Coldwater Ridge like a long-held breath. The kind a man only released once spring had the courage to return. In that bleached silence, the world looked carved from bone pale, brittle, waiting for something warm to touch it. And there beneath the weak glow of the general store lantern stood Lena Marsh, wrapped in nothing more than threadbare resolve. She clutched her arms to her chest, not to warm herself, but to keep herself from collapsing. Her boots were uneven, one heel worn nearly to nothing. Frost clung to her lashes like tiny shards of surrender. She tried to stand small, unnoticed, as if the cold itself could pass her by if she didn't make a sound. But the world has a habit of looking hardest at those trying to disappear. Mabel Huxley spotted her from the tavern's side door, and with a click of her tongue sharp enough to cut rope, waved her away before Lena could even form a full plea. "Not tonight," Mabel snapped, closing the door with a thud that sent Lena flinching. Hunger tightened around her ribs with a familiar ache. She had learned long ago that shame arrived faster than comfort. Sheriff Briggs paused near the hitching post, watching the exchange with folded arms. He didn't speak. He didn't step forward. He simply observed with that dull-eyed caution worn by men who believe mercy complicates their work. Lena lowered her head, the gesture so practiced it had become instinct, and took a single step back into the snowfall. She whispered something to God, to the wind, to herself, but the night swallowed her words before they could rise. Colt Maddox had been returning from the mountain trail, his horse heavy with frost, when he caught sight of her. He wasn't a man quick to intervene. Grief had trimmed his instincts down to the bare bone of necessity. Yet something in the way she stood tilted slightly, as though bracing against a blow no one could see made him slow his pace. The lantern's glow revealed the tremor in her fingers, the purple pinch in her lips. He stopped a few paces away, uncertain. He'd spent years speaking mostly to trees and the occasional mule. He had forgotten the delicate art of approaching another human being without spooking them. Lena noticed him watching. Her body stiffened, fear flickering openly across her face before she forced it down with a breath so small it barely stirred the air. She didn't ask for help. She simply stepped aside, as if making room for everyone else's comfort was her only skill left. That should have been the end of it. Colt could have nodded, walked on, pretended compassion was a luxury he had no business spending. But when she swayed, the world tilted with her, and he reached forward on instinct alone. His hand found her elbow gently, as if touching a glass structure he feared might break beneath too much kindness. She startled at the warmth, her voice cracking like thin ice. "I'm not worth much, sir, but I can cook." The words tumbled out, half apology, half offering. The sort of bargain a desperate soul makes with a world that has taken too much. She expected him to release her, to step back, to treat her as a burden, trying to latch onto his solitude. But Colt didn't say anything. He didn't pit pity against pride or probe for hidden trouble. He simply steadied her and let silence answer, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his frost-dusted hat. Her knees buckled faintly. He slipped his arm around her before she could fall, lifting her upright with slow, sure strength. She gasped, more from the shock of being held than from the cold, and he felt her ribs struggle beneath the thin fabric of her coat. She was light, too light, and suddenly the snow around them seemed wider, emptier, crueler. "Come on," he murmured. The words low, pulled from a place he thought winter had frozen shut. He guided her away from town, his steps purposeful but not hurried, letting her find balance with every shift of his stride. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask why he bothered. She only held onto his sleeve with fingertips so cold they barely curled. The path to his cabin wound upward into pines, draped heavily in winter's white breath. The air tasted sharper there, thin and metallic, the kind that chewed at the lungs if a person breathed too quickly. Lena's steps faltered often, but Colt slowed without comment each time. The quiet between them seemed almost protective, stretching wide but never hollow. When they reached the cabins, small, sturdy, smelling faintly of cedar and long nights spent alone, Colt pushed open the door with his shoulder. Warmth rushed out in a soft wave, brushing against Lena's face like a hand cupping her cheek. She blinked rapidly, as though unsure whether she was allowed to feel something so gentle inside. The room held a kind of rugged simplicity, a single chair worn smooth in the center, a pot-belly stove murmuring with dying embers, shelves lined with tools and jars of dried herbs. Colt set her near the stove without touching her more than necessary. She dropped into a crouch, extending her hands toward the embers. But her fingers trembled too violently to soak in the heat. "I can make something warm," she whispered after a moment, her voice hesitant, eyeing the stew pot resting nearby. If that's all right," he gave her a small nod, stepping aside and letting her into the space as though it had always belonged to her. She moved with caution, not wanting to disturb the room's quiet pride. Her sleeves hung loose at the wrists as she peeled potatoes, her knuckles scraped raw from cold and rough weeks on the road. Yet as she cooked, something in her posture shifted. Confidence, faint as a candle flame in a storm, flickered back to life. She stirred broth gently, the gesture tender, almost reverent, as though feeding someone was the only way she still knew how to be alive. Colt watched her in the low firelight, his arms resting over the back of the worn chair. He didn't speak, didn't just observe the soft determination of a woman piecing herself back together through quiet labor. When she placed the bowl in front of him, he noticed she had given him the larger portion. She said she wasn't hungry. He knew it was a lie, but he let her keep it. Sometimes dignity begins with choosing your own deceptions. He reached for the pot on the stove, poured the rest into a second bowl, and handed it to her without looking at her directly, as if to spare her the embarrassment of gratitude. She gripped the bowl with both hands, holding it like a fragile miracle. For a moment, they ate in silence, each aware of the other's presence, not as intrusion, but as an unexpected easing of loneliness outside. Wind pressed against the cabin walls like a restless spirit, but the room held steady warmth. Lena leaned back, exhaustion softening her features. And for the first time since he'd seen her, her shoulders settled instead of flinched. Colt tended the fire, feeding it slow logs that hissed with melting frost. The glow brightened the space, making the shadows gentler, the corners less sharp. Lena's eyes followed his movements with a caution that slowly, imperceptibly, loosened into trust. The storm outside thickened as the hours passed, snow piling against the windows like a wordless warning. Yet something in that small cabin felt shielded. It's protected by the fragile thread of connection forming between two people who hadn't expected to need each other. When Lena's eyes grew heavy, Colt nodded toward the cot near the stove. She hesitated, but the warmth lured her into surrender. She lay down cautiously, curling beneath the blanket Colt placed over her. Her breath evened out, slow and tired, but no longer desperate. Colt sat quietly in the chair, listening to the wind rake through the pines. He looked at her sleeping face, still shadowed by exhaustion, still fragile as thawing ice, and wondered what kind of past drove a woman to believe her worth measured only by what she could offer others. The thought lingered long after the fire settled into soft glow. Outside, storm deepened until the world beyond the cabin dissolved into white. Inside, warmth and the faint sound of steady breathing filled the small room. Colt felt something shift, subtle as the crack of a log inside the stove, sensed that his long, cold solitude had been breached not by force, but by a quiet presence he hadn't known he needed. And though nothing between them had been said, the night stretched forward with the promise that whatever waited beyond the storm would not be faced alone. The storm had not loosened its grip by morning. Instead, it had pressed deeper into the ridge, turning the world into a white silence that felt almost holy. Lena awoke slowly, as if her body needed permission to return from the safety of sleep. She sat up beneath the blanket Colt had placed over her, watching him from the corner of her eye. He had been awake for hours. She could tell by the faint circles under his eyes, and the way he stood near the window, scanning the horizon as though something out there had the power to take her away again. When she rose, the floorboards creaked like old bones. Colt turned slightly, not startled, but aware of her in the quiet way a man becomes when he's lived too long with only his own shadow for company. He nodded at the stove. "Coffee's warm?" His voice carried the rough cadence of someone unused to speaking first thing in the morning. Lena murmured her thanks and wrapped her hands around the tin cup. The heat bit her palms, grounding her more firmly than any reassurance could. She felt different, still fragile, but less hollow. As if one night of rest had stitched together a few of the frayed threads she'd been dragging behind her. She glanced at Colt, wondering if she appeared changed or if her transformation was too small to be seen by anyone other than herself. The fragile morning calm was broken by a sharp rapping on the door. Colt stiffened. Only a handful of people ventured this high into the ridge, and fewer still during a winter storm. When he opened the door, Sheriff Briggs stepped inside without waiting to be welcomed. Snow spilling around his boots like a trail of dust, Briggs surveyed the cabin with an expression carved from judgment. His eyes landed on Lena, still wrapped in the blanket, still too tired to hide the truth of where she'd slept. "Morning," he said, though his tone made the word feel like an accusation. "Heard you brought someone up here, Colt?" "Town's buzzing." Lena lowered her gaze, the old ache of shame returning as easily as breathing. Gossip had always found her. No matter how far she walked, Colt stood between her and the sheriff. Subtle shift that spoke louder than any declaration. She was freezing, he said simply. Had to bring her somewhere warm. Briggs stared at him for a long moment before lowering his voice. "Just make sure you know what you're inviting into your home. Trouble follows folks like her." He didn't need to say more. The implication hung heavy in the space between them. Lena didn't wait to hear the rest. She slipped quietly out the back door once Briggs turned away, the cold slapping her across the face with a reminder she didn't belong anywhere long. She trudged toward the tree line, her breath shaking in the air, each step deeper into the snow feeling like penance. She told herself she was sparing Colt the burden of defending her. She told herself leaving now was the only kindness she could give him. The forest swallowed her quickly. Snow drummed against the branches overhead, and every gust of wind scraped against her thin coat. She didn't make it far. The cold, stronger today, gnawed at her limbs with merciless intent, and her body betrayed her resolve. She sank against a pine trunk, closing her eyes, thinking perhaps the storm would finish what the world had started long before. She didn't hear Colt approach, didn't hear him call her name. But she felt the warmth of his coat around her shoulders before she saw his face. He knelt in front of her, his breath heavy, his brow tight with something halfway between anger and fear. "Why'd you leave?" he asked, the words thick in his throat. She bowed her head. "I don't want to ruin your name. People already look at me like I carry misfortune." His silence stretched, not sharp but heavy. Then, quietly, he spoke. "I know what it's like to be followed by ghosts." He paused, breath shuddering in the icy air. "My wife died in a storm like this. I wasn't fast enough to save her." Lena looked up sharply. The grief in his eyes wasn't fresh, but it was carved deep, like something winter refused to bury. "I couldn't stop the storm then," Colt continued, lifting her gently to her feet. "But I can stop it from taking you." The vulnerability in his voice rare raw. Offered without expectations, softened something in her chest she hadn't realized was still alive. She leaned into him unconsciously, trusting his steady grip as he guided her back to the cabin. But fate, it seemed, had bided its time. Just as they neared the clearing, a low growl slipped through the wind, deep, threadbare, hungry. Colt tensed. Emerging from the trees was a lone wolf, ribs sharp beneath its winter coat, eyes hollow with desperation. Lena froze. The animal stepped closer, each movement slow, deliberate. It was the kind of danger that didn't need noise to announce itself. Colt shifted forward without thinking, placing himself between her and the wolf. His breath fogged in front of him, gun drawn but lowered, his posture steady but respectful of the creature's instincts. "Easy now," he murmured, the calmness in his tone belying the tension coiled in his limbs. The wolf bared its teeth, snow spraying as it pawed the ground. For a moment, it felt as though the entire forest held its breath. Colt fired a warning shot into the air. The crack split the quiet and echoed down the ridge. The wolf startled backward, then retreated into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of its hunger. Lena exhaled shakily, realizing she had been holding her breath until her lungs burned. Colt holstered the gun with steady hands. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, though her legs trembled. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined naturally, almost instinctively, as though the fear had melted some invisible barrier between them. Back at the cabin, Lena moved with new purpose. She warmed broth, organized the shelves, mended Colt's coat with needle and thread she found tucked away in a corner drawer. Each task steadied her, grounding her in a place she had not yet dared to believe could be a home. Colt watched her quietly, noting every small act with a kind of reverence he didn't speak aloud. He carved a small wooden shelf near the stove, a simple gesture, but one that made Lena pause when she noticed it. A place for her things. A place that suggested he expected her to stay the following day. When the storm finally loosened its grip, Colt brought her into town. Snow glistened on rooftops like shards of glass. People paused as they entered, men with furrowed brows, women whispering behind gloved hands, Mabel Huxley narrowing her eyes with sharp appraisal. The weight of their judgment pressed on Lena's chest. But she stood straighter than she had days before. Sheriff Briggs approached, voice low. "You sure she's not trouble, Colt?" Lena's throat tightened. Old shame surged. But before she could retreat, Colt stepped forward, palms open, stance calm but immovable. "She's with me." The quiet confidence in his voice carried more force than any threat. Briggs hesitated, then backed off. The whispers dulled, though they didn't disappear. They never truly did in towns like this. But Lena no longer shrank beneath them. She looked at Colt, and when their eyes met, something warm and steady passed between them, a promise without words. That night, back at the cabin, she prepared a simple meal: roasted potatoes, warm bread, stew that filled the air with thyme and slow-cooked comfort. Colt set the table, 2 plates placed side by side. As they sat, their hands brushed, lingered, then rested lightly atop one another. No grand declarations, no rushing of emotion, just the quiet merging of 2 lives shaped by loss and loneliness. Outside, snow drifted softly, no longer fierce but tender, as if the storm itself had exhaled inside. Warmth gathered around them like a blessing, and though neither spoke it aloud, both understood that something had begun, something fragile, gentle, and worth protecting. If this tale stirred something warm in you, friend, don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West tales.